Before I tell you the rest of this story, I need to ask you something small. If you've ever loved someone so deeply that their betrayal didn't just crack your heart, it nearly ended you, then please stay with me until the end. Because what I'm about to share still keeps me awake at night. Not from fear anymore, from grief. The kind that doesn't have a clean name. My name is Henry. I'm 67. I live in a small house on the edge of Kingston, Ontario. The kind of town where neighbors still wave from their driveways in winter, where the coffee shop on Brock Street knows your order before you speak. I retired 3 years ago after 29 years working for the city's public works department. My wife Margaret passed from pancreatic cancer 5 years ago last April. Since then, it's just been me, my old beagle named Baxter, and a particular quiet that fills a house when the person who filled it is gone. I have one daughter. Her name is Chloe. She's 38 and she's the reason I'm still alive, but not in the way you might think. After Margaret died, I went through a long gray tunnel. I kept working another year, mostly to have somewhere to be. When I finally retired, the tunnel got darker. My doctor put me on a mild antidepressant. My neighbor, Frank, used to check on me most mornings, knock on the back door, make sure I'd eaten. Chloe called every Sunday evening. We'd talk for maybe 20 minutes about Baxter, the weather, whatever she was watching on TV. Surface level. But I was grateful. She was busy. She had her own life in Hamilton, her own problems, though I didn't know the half of it yet. The Sunday calls became Friday calls. Then she started dropping by. At first, maybe once a month, then every 2 weeks. She'd arrive around supper time with a casserole dish covered in foil, or a container of soup, or one of those pre-made lasagnas from the grocery store on Princess Street. She'd stay 2, maybe 3 hours. We'd eat together, watch a bit of television, and then she'd drive back to Hamilton. I was touched. Chloe had always been independent, headstrong, and self-sufficient, just like her mother. After Margaret died, our relationship had been cordial but careful. These visits felt like something was shifting. Like we were figuring out how to be family again, just the two of us. I told Frank about it one morning over coffee. "She's really stepping up," I said. He nodded and said family was important. I believed that with everything I had. What I didn't notice, what I couldn't have noticed because it happened so gradually, was that I was always tired after she left. Not pleasantly tired. Something heavier. A tiredness that started in my bones and moved outward. I'd fall asleep in my armchair before 9 most nights she visited. And I'd wake up the next morning groggy and disoriented, foggy until well past noon. I assumed it was my age. I assumed it was the antidepressants. I assumed a lot of things. Because I didn't want to assume the one thing that turned out to be true. It was Frank who first said something. He didn't mean it as an accusation. He was just being frank, blunt in the way small-town men of a certain generation are blunt without malice. Just honesty. We were standing in my driveway one Saturday morning and he said, "Henry, you look rough, pal. You feeling all right?" I told him I'd been sleeping badly. "You sleep badly every time your daughter visits?" He said, just like that. A simple observation. Then he went back inside his house, and I stood there in the cold and thought about whether that was true. It was true. I started paying closer attention. I started writing things down in a little notebook. Nothing formal. Just notes. What day Chloe visited, what she brought, how I felt the next morning. 4 visits in a row, the pattern held. She'd bring food or drinks. I'd eat or drink them. I'd be unconscious by 9. I'd feel terrible until at least noon the next day. The 5th visit, I decided to do something I'm still not entirely proud of, even though it saved my life. She brought a thermos of homemade chamomile tea. She said she'd made it herself, that chamomile was good for my sleep. She poured me a mug and set it on the side table next to my armchair. We talked for a while. At some point, when she got up to use the bathroom, I poured the tea into the spider plant on the windowsill. Margaret had always kept spider plants. I'd managed not to kill them. I figured they could handle whatever was in that tea better than I apparently could. When Chloe came back, she glanced at the empty mug. She smiled. That night, I stayed awake until 11:30. I wasn't groggy the next morning. The spider plant was dead within 48 hours. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at that plant for a long time. Baxter put his head on my knee. I didn't cry. I think I was beyond crying at that point, into something colder and more terrible. Because you have to understand, this wasn't a stranger. This was Chloe. This was the little girl I'd taught to ride a bike in the parking lot of the Canadian Tire on a Sunday morning because Margaret was working and we had nowhere else to go. This was the young woman I'd driven 4 hours to Ottawa to help move into her first apartment. This was my daughter, and she had been putting something in my tea. I called Frank, not the police. "Not yet," Frank, because I needed to say it out loud to someone who knew me before I could do anything else. He came over within 10 minutes. I showed him the plant and the notebook. He sat very quietly for a while. Then he said, "Henry, you need to call someone official." He said it gently, like he was handing me something fragile. I called the Ontario Provincial Police non-emergency line. The next morning, I explained what I had observed. They sent 2 officers to my house that afternoon. A younger woman and an older man whose manner reminded me of a high school vice principal. Serious, measured, careful. They listened. They looked at the notebook. They looked at the plant. They asked if I still had the thermos. I did. It was still sitting on my kitchen counter. They took it. What came back from the lab 2 weeks later is something I still have difficulty saying out loud. The tea had been laced with a sedative, a prescription sleep medication, ground up and dissolved. Not enough to kill me outright. Enough to make me foggy. Enough over time to make me seem confused, disoriented to anyone watching from the outside. To a doctor, to a lawyer, to a judge, it might have looked like the early stages of cognitive decline. I am not in cognitive decline. I have never been diagnosed with anything of the sort. My GP has my full medical history, and she will tell you the same thing. But I understand now what the plan was, or what I believe the plan was. Because the full shape of it only became clear when the police started asking questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Chloe was in serious financial trouble. I didn't know the extent of it. I knew she and her ex-husband had gone through a difficult split 2 years earlier. Legal fees, a move. I knew she'd taken on some debt. I didn't know she owed close to $90,000. I didn't know she'd borrowed against her line of credit 3 times in 18 months. I didn't know she had consulted twice with a lawyer about power of attorney. My house is paid off. I own it outright. Margaret and I made the final mortgage payment 12 years ago. It's not worth a fortune by Toronto standards, but in Kingston, it's worth somewhere between $400,000 and $450,000. My pension, between CPP and my city plan, is reasonable. I have savings. I am, by any modest measure, comfortable. And I have a will that leaves everything to Chloe. The police explained it to me carefully without drama, which I appreciated. If I had appeared over time to be losing my mental faculties, confused, forgetful, disoriented, it would have been straightforward for Chloe to pursue guardianship, power of attorney for personal care, control over my finances. The medication in the tea wouldn't have shown up unless someone was specifically looking for it. And no one was looking because no one had any reason to suspect. I would have been a sad, aging widower in gradual decline. It happens every day. It would have been unremarkable. Except that Frank noticed I looked rough, and I kept a notebook, and a spider plant died. They arrested Chloe on a Tuesday. I know this because Frank drove me to the coffee shop afterward, and we sat there for 2 hours without saying very much. I had a large double-double and a blueberry muffin, and I stared out the window at the parking lot and thought about the bike lessons in the Canadian Tire lot. About carrying her on my shoulders at the waterfront when she was 4 years old because she couldn't see over the crowd for the Canada Day fireworks. About the look on her face at Margaret's funeral. Crumpled and young and lost. The way grief makes everyone look like a child again. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. I know some people, when they hear a story like this, are waiting for the part where justice feels satisfying. Where the bad person gets what they deserve and the good person feels vindicated. I can only tell you honestly that it doesn't feel like that. It feels like a particular kind of loss that has no word in English. The French might have something. I don't know. What came out in the weeks that followed was complicated, and in some ways made things harder rather than easier. Chloe's lawyer argued, and the Crown took it seriously enough to pursue an assessment that she was not entirely well. She had been struggling with a gambling addiction for 3 years. I did not know this. She had been in and out of Gamblers Anonymous. She had relapsed twice. The debt she'd accumulated was almost entirely from online gambling, the kind that's incredibly easy to access in Ontario now. Regulated and advertised everywhere you look. The lawyer argued that her judgment had been severely compromised, that she'd been in a desperate tunnel and had made decisions that the healthy version of herself never would have made. I don't know what to do with that. I mean that literally. I have sat with it for months and I still don't know, because it doesn't change what she did. The tea was real. The sedative was real. The plan, whatever its full shape, was real. And yet I know my daughter. I know there is a version of her. The version I raised, the version Margaret loved, that would be horrified by what that other version did. I believe that. I have to believe it, because the alternative is that I never knew her at all, and I can't carry that. She pleaded guilty in the end to criminal negligence causing bodily harm. Her sentence included a conditional discharge, mandatory participation in a treatment program for addiction and mental health, and supervised probation for 2 years. No prison. I know that will frustrate some people. It frustrated me for a while. But the Crown explained that given the circumstances, her medical history, her cooperation, the absence of a prior record, incarceration was unlikely to serve anyone well. The judge said something that has stayed with me, though I won't try to quote it exactly. Something about how the law's job in cases like this is sometimes not to punish, but to repair. I'm not sure I fully believe that yet, but I'm trying to. Chloe is in a residential treatment program in Guelph. She's been there for 4 months. We have not spoken directly. Her counselor sent me a letter with Chloe's permission, saying that she is engaging seriously with the program and that when she is ready, if I am willing, she would like to talk. The counselor was careful to say that there is no obligation, that my well-being matters too. I appreciated that more than I expected to. Baxter died in January. Old age, the vet said. His heart just gave out. I buried him in the backyard under the cedar tree, which is not technically legal within city limits, but which Frank helped me do anyway. At 7 in the morning before anyone was awake. We didn't talk much. We just dug. Then we went inside and I made eggs, and we ate them at the kitchen table, and Frank said, "Good dog." And I said, "Yeah?" And that was enough. I have a new GP appointment next month. My regular doctor has retired, and I'm being transferred to a younger physician at the community health center. I've been told she's thorough and good with older patients. I'm bringing my full file, the lab results, everything. I'm not hiding any of it. Whatever happens to my health from here, whatever the long-term effects of those months of low-grade sedation turn out to be, I want someone who knows the whole picture. I've also updated my will, not out of anger, out of clarity. There's now a provision that in the event I become incapacitated, any major financial decisions must be approved by both my lawyer and Frank, who has agreed to serve in that role. Frank complained mildly that this was a lot of paperwork for a man who had been planning to spend his retirement fishing. I told him I'd buy him a new rod. He said that wasn't necessary. I bought one anyway. I don't know what happens next with Chloe. I think about it more than I probably should. In the way you think about things at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and Baxter's not there to put his head on your knee anymore. I think about calling her. I think about what I would say. I think about whether I'm capable of the kind of forgiveness that would let us have some kind of relationship on the other side of this. And I genuinely don't know the answer. What I do know, what I wake up every morning knowing, is that I poured out that tea. That something in me, some instinct I couldn't name at the time said, "Not tonight." And that small act of quiet refusal, that one moment of inexplicable caution, is the reason I'm sitting here to tell you any of this. I am 67 years old. I have been a husband, a father, a public servant, a widower. I've kept a small house warm through 35 Ontario winters. I have loved people imperfectly and been loved imperfectly in return. And I have learned, later than I should have, that paying attention to patterns, to your own body, to the small things that don't quite fit, is not paranoia. It is survival. If you have someone in your life whose behavior has shifted in ways that make you uneasy, even in ways you can't articulate, trust that unease. Write it down. Tell someone. You don't have to have proof. You don't have to be certain. You just have to be honest with yourself about what you're seeing. I wish I had been honest with myself sooner. But I'm here, and some days, that still surprises me. I've thought a lot about the spider plant. It sounds absurd, I know. A man nearly loses everything, his health, his home, his sense of who his own child is, and what he keeps coming back to is a houseplant sitting dead on a windowsill. But that's where my mind goes, because the plant didn't choose to pour out that tea. I did, and I think about what it means that such a small decision, impulsive, almost unconscious, was the thing that separated what happened from what could have happened. I didn't pour it out because I was clever. I poured it out because something in me had been paying attention even when I thought I wasn't. All those mornings of waking up foggy, all those afternoons of feeling like I was moving through water, all those notes in that little notebook. They weren't just documentation. They were me, refusing quietly without fully knowing it to stop trusting myself. That's the part I want to say clearly because I think it matters. I almost talked myself out of suspicion a dozen times. I almost told myself I was being paranoid. That I was a lonely old man looking for patterns that weren't there. That Chloe loved me, and I should be grateful she was coming around at all. The cost of ignoring what your own body and your own mind are telling you can be enormous. I'm not saying distrust everyone. I'm saying that the instinct which tells you something is wrong deserves to be taken seriously. Even when, especially when, the person involved is someone you love. That instinct is a form of intelligence. It's the accumulated weight of everything you've observed, processed quietly, filed away. When it speaks, it deserves a fair hearing. What Chloe did was wrong. I will not soften that or excuse it away. Whatever state she was in, whatever desperation had narrowed her world down to a series of terrible choices, she made those choices. The tea was real. The sedative was real. The plan was real. And the consequence of that is something she will carry and something I will carry for the rest of our lives. That's how actions work. They don't disappear when we regret them. They stay in the world and they shape what comes after. But I've also had to sit with the harder question: what do I do with the parts of her that I still recognize? The little girl who cried at Margaret's funeral. The young woman who called every Sunday because she didn't know what else to do. Those parts of her didn't vanish. They got buried under debt and shame and a sickness she didn't ask for and didn't treat in time. I don't think understanding that means forgiving everything automatically. I think it means keeping the door cracked instead of slamming it shut. Not for her sake only. For mine. Frank helped me dig a hole in the backyard for Baxter in January, and neither of us said much. That kind of friendship, steady, undemanding, present, is worth more than I ever told him. Intelligence isn't just what you know. It's knowing who to call at 7 in the morning when you need someone to just show up and dig. I'm still here. 67 years old. Living in my paid-off house in Kingston, drinking my own tea made by my own hands. That's enough for now.